Every parish in South Louisiana keeps a family that the maps forget on purpose. In the low country past the last paved road, where the water turns the colour of strong coffee and the cypress lean like old men bent to hear a thing said far away, there was one name that census takers learned to spell before they learned the roads: Thibodeaux. 7 cabins on a spit of black earth that no two surveyors ever measured the same way, on a bend of water that changed its own shape between one flood season and the next. For more than 100 years, the people of the surrounding parish taught their children to stay off that water. They said the family down there had gone wrong, gone strange, gone deep into a thing the church up the road could not put a name to. A deputy went in during a dry autumn and came back 3 days later with his shirt buttoned wrong and no memory of where his boat had gone. A state surveyor went in with a full field book and came back with 3 pages torn out of it and a story he carried to his grave without ever telling it once. And when a young parish coroner finally forced those cabin doors open in the wet spring of a year the family had painted on their own wall long before that man was born, what he found underneath the 7 cabins did not only expose the most feared family the parish had ever whispered about, it quietly rewrote the age of the ground they were all standing on. Before we go a single foot further onto that water, I want you to do one thing for me. Somewhere near where you grew up there was a place shaped like this. A house at the end of a road that nobody drove down twice. A family that nobody discussed above the low hum of a kitchen. A name that made the old folks change the subject and look at the window. Tell me about yours down in the comments. Give me the parish, the county, the road, the name if you still carry it. I read every last one. And the stories you leave behind are how places like this stay remembered at all once the water takes the rest. Now come down with me onto Bayou Cendre, into Verdun Parish, and let me show you why the Thibodeaux name still empties a room 100 miles from where the last of them stood. To understand the Thibodeaux family, you first have to understand that Verdun Parish does not sit where the state believes it sits. Pull the oldest survey the courthouse still holds, the one drawn in 1856 by a Creole engineer named Adrien Follet, and lay it beside the modern parish map, and the two of them refuse to agree on the simplest thing in the world, which is where the solid ground ends and the water begins. Follet drew a broad tongue of high land curling south into the marsh, nearly 2 miles of it, dry enough to farm, marked with the small square that meant a standing structure already old when he passed. The modern map shows open water there. Nothing but open water and a scatter of drowned trees. 2 miles of land that the parish once taxed and buried its dead on, simply gone, and no flood in the written record big enough to account for the taking of it. The Thibodeaux cabins stood on the last dry remnant of that vanished tongue of land. That is the first thing the outside world never grasped. The family were not squatters who had drifted out to the edge of the map to hide from the law. They were the final holdouts on high ground that had been shrinking under them for longer than the parish had existed, and they refused, generation after generation, to come in off it. When the water rose, they raised the floors. When a cabin went under, they built the next one higher and further back, always on the same shrinking spine of earth, as if leaving it were the one thing they were not permitted to do. The old people up the bayou had an explanation, and it was not a kind one. They said the family stayed because the family was chained to something down there, something that had been given to the first Thibodeaux to keep, and that the keeping of it had bent them out of the ordinary shape of people across so many lifetimes that the ones alive now hardly counted as their neighbours anymore. Traiteurs, the folk healers of that country, would treat anyone who came to their doors, a snake bite, a fever, a baby turned the wrong way. They would not go down to Bayou Cendre, not for money, not for mercy, not for a dying child. When you ask a bayou healer why she will not cross a certain stretch of water, and she answers that the water down there is older than the water everywhere else, you are hearing something that has nothing to do with reason and everything to do with a memory the parish could not quite finish forgetting. Here is where the story stops being a ghost tale and starts being a problem for anyone who likes the ground under their feet to behave. In the autumn of 1911, the state sent a surveyor named Wallace Kern down to settle a tax dispute over exactly that drowned high ground, because a company out of New Orleans wanted to drain and log it and needed to know whose name sat on the deed. Kern was a careful, sober man with 14 years of marsh survey behind him and no patience for local stories. He hired a Thibodeaux boy to pole him down Bayou Sondre, and he spent 2 days walking what little dry land was left, and he did the one thing no one down there had done in living memory. He dug. Under the black muck of the Thibodeaux yard, a little more than 4 feet down, Wallace Kern's spade struck cut stone, not river rock, not the soft shell and clay that every foundation in that country was raised on. Dressed, squared, fitted stone, laid in courses, mortared with something pale and hard that did not match any lime the parish had ever burned. He followed it with his probe rod for the better part of an afternoon and mapped a wall that ran straight and true under the mud for over 90 feet before it turned a perfect corner and ran on. A worked stone structure, enormous, buried whole beneath a swamp on the Gulf Coast, in a place where there is no native stone for 200 miles in any direction, and where every schoolbook swore that nothing but Spanish moss and alligators had ever lived. And sitting on top of it, in 7 leaning cabins, the family that had spent a century making sure no outsider ever put a spade in that yard. The whole time he dug, the family watched. Not one of them tried to stop him, which frightened his hired boy far more than any threat would have. The old woman sat in a low chair on the highest porch with her hands folded and her eyes on the growing hole, and every hour or so one of the grown sons would carry a bucket of the excavated muck down to the water and pour it back into the bayou, careful and slow, the way a man returns something borrowed. When Kern asked why they were putting the mud back, the boy polling him would only say that the family did not like the ground to be short, not the family did not like the digging. The family did not like the ground to be short, as though what came out of that hole was owed back to it by weight, and a debt would come due if the yard ended the day lighter than it started. Kern wrote all of it down. The depth, the courses, the strange pale mortar, the 90 feet of wall and the corner it turned. He sketched the footprint as far as his rod could trace it. And then he went back to the family's fire that evening to ask the old woman who ran the 7 cabins one straight question. What was her family living on top of? What she told him filled the 3 pages he would later tear out of his own field book with his own hands before he would let another living soul read them. Before we move on to what Wallace Kern found on those 3 torn pages, stop for a second. What you just heard about the worked stone buried 4 feet under that swamp yard is the part that changes everything. But it only makes sense when you see it written out next to the surveyor's own field sketch. The dressed stone, the impossible corner. It's all in the document linked below. Take 5 seconds right now, grab it, and then come back. Because what comes next builds directly on it. The link is in the description. QR code is on your screen. Wallace Kern never filed his survey. The tax dispute that sent him down Bayou Sondre simply died in the courthouse. The New Orleans company withdrew its interest in the drowned land without explanation, and the 2 miles of high ground stayed drowned and untaxed and off the books for another 60 years. Kern himself left the Marsh survey entirely within the month. He took a clerk's job counting freight in Baton Rouge, a job so far beneath his training that his own family could not understand it, and he held it quietly until he died. He tore the 3 pages out of his field book, but he did not burn them. A careful man cannot burn the truth, even when he can no longer stand to read it. He folded them into the back of a family Bible, and there they sat until his granddaughter found them after the Second World War and could make neither sense nor peace of what her grandfather had written. The pages are mostly measurements, and the measurements are the reason the story matters, because Kern did not stop at the 90 feet of wall he had probed in the yard. That night, with the family's permission, which he never explained how he obtained, he walked the shrinking spine of high ground from the cabins down to the water's edge, and he found the wall again where the land dropped away. It ran on under the bayou. He waded out at low tide with a plumb line and a lantern, and he traced the top course of that buried structure for as far as he dared go into the black water, and by his own reckoning the thing did not end. 90 feet became 300. 300 turned another corner. He was standing on the roof line, he wrote, of a building so large that the 7 cabins of the Thibodeaux family sat upon one small corner of it like gulls on the back of something asleep under the mud. And then there is the sentence that made his granddaughter fold the pages back up and not speak of them for another 20 years. Kern wrote that the old woman had walked out into the water beside him that night, in the cold, an old woman of at least 80, and had put her bare hand flat against a place on the submerged wall where the stone was carved. She told him the carving was a door. She told him her family had been set to mine that door since before there was a France to send Frenchmen to Louisiana, since before the river ran where it ran now, since a time she named with a word Kern did not know and wrote down as best he could by sound, and that the parish above them was a young and foolish thing that had grown up like grass over the roof of a house it did not know it was living in. Then she asked him, this careful, sober man with 14 years of survey behind him, whether he wanted to know why the ground could never be allowed to go short. And Wallace Kern, who had come to measure land for a logging company, said no. He said no, and he poled back to dry country in the dark, and he spent the rest of his life counting freight cars so that he would never again have to look at anything that did not add up the way the world had promised him it would. Now hold that word she used, the word for the time before, because it comes back. Everyone who ever got close to the Thibodeaux family and lived to describe it came away with a piece of the same word, spelled a dozen different ways, and none of them the same as any language the parish spoke. Follett, the engineer who drew the 1856 survey, wrote a note in his own margin about the family that guarded the old ground and used a version of it. A Jesuit priest who tried to bring the family into the church in the 1790s left a letter using another. They are not quite the same word, but they are cousins, the way the same coin looks different, worn down by different pockets, and every one of them refers to the same thing, which is a world before this one that ended in mud and water, and a family appointed to sit on the last dry door of it and keep it shut. This is the exact point where the people of Verdun Parish stopped listening and started calling the Thibodeaux deranged, and I understand why. It is a great deal easier to say that a family living out on drowned ground had simply gone inbred and mad across 100 lonely years than it is to sit with the alternative. The alternative is that the family was right. The alternative is that they were the sanest people in the parish, the only ones who remembered correctly what the ground beneath the Louisiana Bayou actually is and how it came to be there, and that everyone calling them mad was living, comfortable and unbothered, on top of a buried world they had never once thought to question. Madness is a kinder story. Madness lets you keep your own footing. So the parish chose madness for the family and against the mud, and it held to that choice with the fierceness of people who suspect they have chosen wrong. But choosing to call them mad did not make the parish leave them alone. If anything, it made the meddling worse, because a mad family on cursed ground is a magnet for exactly the sort of person who cannot resist proving that there is nothing to be afraid of. Across the next several decades, a slow procession of the curious and the certain went down Bayou Cendra to have a look at the deranged Thibodeaux Clan and their drowned stone, a folklore student from the State University, a Baptist revival preacher with a mind to save them, a pair of oil company men in 1928 looking for the same thing the logging company had wanted, only now the prize under the mud was not timber but whatever sat in the pore spaces of that impossible foundation. Each of them came back changed in some small permanent way, or did not come back at all, and each of them added one more measurement to a picture the parish refused to assemble. It would take the wet spring the old woman had marked on her wall, and a young coroner too new to the job to know he was supposed to be afraid, before anyone put the measurements together and understood what the Thibodeaux family had actually been keeping shut all that time. To sit with the alternative, you have to look hard at the cypress. Anyone who has stood in an old Louisiana swamp knows the giant trees, the bald cypress that were already broad and hollow when the first Europeans poled up these bayous. Some of them counted at well over 1,000 years of growth. The loggers took most of the true giants a century ago, floated them out and sawed them into the floors of houses that still stand in New Orleans today. But out on Bayou Cendra, on the drowned Thibodeaux ground, a handful of them were never cut, and they are not the size of the giants the loggers took. They are larger. There is one the family called the grandpère, the grandfather, and 3 men could not link hands around its base, and its crown was dead and silver, and had been dead in living memory, and around its foot the water stood in a perfect ring as though the tree sat in the mouth of a well. Here is what a forester notices about the grandpère, and cannot explain. Its base does not taper into the ground the way a tree's base should. It flares, and then it goes straight down into the mud like a column, like a thing planted rather than grown, and where you would expect roots you find, when you probe, more of the same dressed pale stone that Kern found under the yard. The tree is not growing in the swamp. The tree is growing out of the roof of the buried structure, straight up through a gap in that ancient stone, and it has been doing so for longer than the swamp has existed, which means the structure is older than a tree that was already ancient when Christ was born. The parish never let itself do that arithmetic. The Thibodeaux family did it every morning when they looked out their doors, and it is a heavy sum to carry, and I think carrying it is most of what the parish mistook for madness. The family's own account of themselves, pieced together from the fragments the outsiders wrote down, went like this. Long before the water, before the bayou, before the coast lay where it lies, there was dry country here, and a people on it who built in stone, and lived a long time, and knew the working of the land, the way we know the working of a light switch. Something ended them. The family did not say a flood in the way we mean rain and a swollen river. They said the mud came up, that the ground itself rose like bread, and swallowed the low places and drowned the tall ones, that the sky went the colour of a bruise for a season, and the sea walked inland and did not fully walk back. When it was over, the old world lay under a fresh skin of earth as though it had never been, and the few who lived crawled out onto the new soft ground and forgot, on purpose and quickly, because remembering was more than a person could hold. All but one line of them. One family was made to remember. One family was set on the last high place where a door of the old world still reached the surface, and told to keep it shut and keep the ground full and never ever leave, because what was on the other side of that door was the reason the mud had come up in the first place. You can call that a swamp family's tall tale, and for 200 years the parish did. But the tall tale has an unpleasant habit of matching the dirt. When the State Geological Survey finally cored the Verdun Marsh in the 1970s, chasing oil, they found what they always find under that coast, layer on layer of ordinary delta mud, and then, at a depth that should have been nothing but more of the same, a horizon. A clean, flat line of a different material entirely, a dense pale clay full of shattered worked stone and carbonized wood, and, in two of the cores, fragments of that same hard pale mortar laid down all at once across the entire region in what one baffled geologist described in his notes as a single depositional event of enormous energy, a whole landscape buried in one stroke. He did not know what to make of it, and the survey moved on, because oil was the point and buried worlds were not on the funding. But the family had told them exactly what they would find 60 years before they cored it. The mud came up. It is right there in the ground, one flat pale line under everyone's feet, and the only people in the parish who had ever named it out loud were the ones the parish had agreed to call insane. By the time we reached the modern part of this story, the family was down to very few. The high ground had shrunk to a muddy acre. The 7 cabins had become 4, then 3. The old woman Kern, met in 1911, was long dead, or was said to be, and the line was held now by a matriarch the parish knew only as Mère Odile, who nobody living could remember arriving and nobody could put an age to, and by a scatter of grown children and grandchildren who came and went from the dry world for supplies and spoke to no one and married no one and always went back down onto that water before dark. They were poor in the way that has nothing to do with laziness, and everything to do with a job that pays nothing and cannot be quit. Their work was the ground and the door, and they kept both. Night after night they watched the mud line the way a night nurse watches a chest rise and fall, and they waited for a spring that Mère Odile had marked on the inside wall of the highest cabin in charcoal. A year and a season written up there, among 100 other years, going back further than charcoal should survive. Each one crossed through, each one a season the door had held. The wet spring on that wall that had not yet been crossed through was the one the young coroner walked into. And to understand why a parish coroner of all people was the one to finally force those doors, you have to understand what started happening to the water, and to the people who lived along it, in the 18 months before he ever heard the Thibodeaux name. It began with the fish. Shrimpers working the lower reaches of Bayou Cendré started pulling up their nets, fouled with a pale grey silt that had not been there the season before, a fine, dense clay that stank of something old and mineral and clung to everything it touched. The water dropped in places it had never dropped and rose in places it had never risen. A shell road that had carried trucks for 40 years went under 1 week and did not come back. Old men who had read that country their whole lives said the same uneasy thing in different words, which was that the ground was moving, that the bayou was rearranging itself the way a sleeper shifts before waking, and that they did not care for the direction of the shifting. It was moving toward the Thibodeaux ground, or the Thibodeaux ground was reaching out to meet it. Either way, the pale silt got thicker the closer you poled to those cabins, and the shrimpers stopped going down that far, and then people started to go missing. Not many. This is the bayou, and the bayou takes people every year to storms and gators and drink and their own bad boats, and the parish is practiced at not asking too hard. But these were wrong in ways that itched at a person. A trapper named Sonny or Coin went to check his lines below the old shell road, and his boat came home without him, idling in slow circles against a cypress knee, his gear untouched, his thermos still warm. A pair of teenagers dared each other down toward the drowned ground on a summer night, and only one came back, and the one who came back could not stop talking about a light under the water and a sound like a great slow door, and within a month his family had moved him to a facility upstate and stopped taking calls. Each time the body never surfaced, which on that coast is unusual enough to note, and each time the last known position was a little further down Bayou Sondra, a little closer to the 7 cabins that were now 3, as though something were working its way up the water toward the dry world, one person at a time. The coroner of Verdun Parish was a young man named Émile Boudreau, and he was young enough and new enough to the office that he still believed a missing body was a problem to be solved rather than a subject to be changed. He had grown up 2 parishes over, gone to school in New Orleans, come back with a medical degree, and a stubborn modern certainty that the old bayou fears were a kind of poverty, a thing that happened to people who had been given too little and frightened too young. He did not believe in doors under the water. He believed in currents and decomposition and the specific gravity of a drowned man. And when the count of the missing reached a number he could no longer file away as ordinary, he did the thing none of his predecessors had been willing to do. He went down Bayou Sondra himself, with a deputy and a camera and a folder of paperwork, to interview the Thibodeaux family about their neighbours and, if it came to it, to search their ground. Before he went, he did his homework, and his homework was the second thing that will not let this story rest. Émile pulled every parish record the courthouse held on the family, meaning to build an ordinary picture of an ordinary clan, birth records, death records, the census going back as far as the census went, and the records would not behave. The same handful of Thibodeaux given names ran down the columns decade after decade, which is common enough in an isolated family, but the ages did not reset the way ages must. In the census of 1880, a Thibodeaux woman was listed as head of household, age given as somewhere past 70, keeper of the low ground. In 1900, the same given name, the same role, the age again given as past 70. In 1920, again. The enumerators, different men in different decades who never compared notes, had each walked down to those cabins, looked at the old woman running them, and each written down an old woman running them, and never once in 60 years recorded a birth that would have produced a new one or a death that would have retired the last. Émile did what a modern man does with a pattern like that. He looked for the trick, reused names, he told himself. A grandmother's name passed to a granddaughter, the enumerators too lazy to distinguish them, the ages estimated and wrong. It is a good explanation, and it covers most of the data, and it falls apart on one document, a single sheet, a traiteur's healing record kept by a family up the bayou who had once, generations back, before the parish learned to stay away, traded remedies with the low ground. That record, named a Thibodeaux woman, described a mark on her hand, a pale seam of scar across the palm like a healed burn, and dated the visit to 1791. And the Jesuit's letter from that same decade described the matriarch of the low ground and noted, in the offhand way a man notes a detail he does not know is important, the strange pale scar across her right palm, the one she said came from the door. And Wallace Kern, in 1911, on those torn pages, described the old woman who put her bare hand flat against the carved stone in the black water, and wrote that her palm bore a pale seam of scar, and that when he asked about it she called it the mark of the keeping. 1791, 1911, the same scar on the same hand across 120 years, described by 3 men who never met and had no reason to invent the same detail. Émile Boudreau sat in the courthouse basement with those 3 documents fanned out in front of him and felt, for the first time in his careful modern life, the specific cold that his grandmother's generation had spent their whole lives arranging themselves around. He did not believe it. He would tell himself all the way down the bayou that he did not believe it. But he made a photograph of each document, and he put the photographs in his breast pocket over his heart, which is not a thing a man does with information he truly thinks is nonsense, and he went to meet the woman with the scar on her hand. The trip down took most of a morning, and the further they went, the less the country looked like the country Émile Boudreau had grown up beside. The pale silt thickened in the water until the boat left a wake like a spoon dragged through cold gravy. The cypress changed. Up top they were the ordinary ragged trees of any Louisiana swamp, but as the boat approached the drowned ground they grew older and stranger, and then he saw the grand-père, the dead silver giant standing in its ring of open water, and even his modern certainty went quiet for a moment in front of a living thing that size. The deputy, a local man named Parish who had not wanted to come and had said so twice, cut the motor without being told and let them drift the last stretch in on the current, because it did not feel right to bring an engine any closer, and neither man said a word about why. The 3 remaining cabins stood on their stilts on a muddy acre that was visibly, actively losing its fight with the water. Émile could see the high tide line on the pilings, and could see that the high tide now reached the floorboards. He could see, along the base of the highest cabin, a row of buckets and washtubs and old kettles, and he understood before anyone told him that the family was carrying mud, that they were out there in the nights, hauling silt up out of the bayou and packing it against the shrinking ground, trying to keep the acre from going short and losing. And he could see the family on the porches, still and watching, the way every visitor for 200 years had described them watching, and at the top, in the low chair, an old woman with her hands folded, and even from the water he could see the pale seam across her right palm catch the light. Mère Odile received him the way you receive weather. She did not rise, did not startle, did not ask his business. She told him he was late, which unsettled him more than a threat would have, and she told him to send the frightened deputy back up to wait at the Shell Road, because what needed saying was not for a man who would only carry it wrong. Émile, to his credit and his later cost, sent Parish back, and the deputy went gladly, and that decision is why we have any account of what happened on the low ground at all, because Parish lived, and the record he later gave, haltingly, to a priest and then to a hospital board, is most of what survived. Alone with her, Émile did the thing he had come to do. He laid out his folder, he named the missing, Sonny Orcoin, and the teenagers, and the others, and he asked the old woman flatly whether her family knew anything about where those people had gone, and Mère Odile answered him with a patience that was worse than any lie, because she answered as though she were explaining the tide to a child who had accused it of stealing his sandcastle on purpose. The people were not taken, she said. The people were let in. There is a difference, and the difference is the whole of my family's work, and you have come at the one time in 4 generations when we are failing to keep it, so I will tell you plainly, coroner, and you will not believe me, and then you will make me show you. After I show you, you will be one more man who spends the rest of his life pretending he cannot count. Then she told him what her family kept, and it matched, word for word in its bones, every fragment the outsiders had carried out for 200 years, the buried world, and the mud that rose, and the door on the last high place. But she told it forward, into his own time, which none of the fragments had done. The keeping was failing, she said, and it was failing because the ground was going short, faster than 3 tired people could fill it, and it was going short because the thing behind the door had learned, after all this time, that the family was almost gone. It was pulling, it was drawing the ground down, and the water up, and where the skin between the worlds wore thinnest, at the deep places out under the drowned road, it was reaching through and taking people, not to harm them, she said, but to fill itself, the way a starving thing eats, the way the old world had eaten the one before it when the mud came up. Every person the bayou had swallowed in the last 18 months was somewhere behind that door right now, she said, kept and unaging in the dark, the way she herself had been kept unaging on this side of it, and if the door came fully open, if the last of her family lost the ground, then what took those few would take the parish, and then the coast, and then it would walk inland the way it had walked once before, and lay a new pale line down over everything, and the world above would crawl out onto fresh mud in 100 years and forget, on purpose and quickly, that any of us had ever been here at all. Émile Boudreau did not believe her. He wrote later that he did not believe her, but he asked to see the wall, the one the parish rumour said was marked, because a coroner is a man trained to trust the physical evidence over the living witness, and Mère Odile rose from her low chair for the first time and took him inside the highest cabin, and there it was, the charcoal wall. Years upon years upon years of them going up into the dark of the rafters and down into places where the charcoal should have crumbled to nothing a dozen lifetimes ago, each year written and crossed through, each one a season the keeping had held. He found 1791 on that wall. He found 1911. He found the year of the state cause in the 70s. And near the bottom, at eye level, freshest, uncrossed, he found the wet spring he was standing in, written up there and waiting for him, and beside it, in the same hand, 3 words that stopped his modern heart in his modern chest, because they were not a date and they were not a name, they were an instruction, and the instruction was addressed to the coroner. The instruction on the wall said, "Keep the ground full." 3 words, in charcoal that should not have lasted a season, waiting at the exact height of a standing man's eyes for a coroner who had been born decades after they were written. Émile Boudreau stood in that cabin and did the arithmetic he had refused to do in the courthouse basement. And this time there was no document to set it against and no basement to leave it in, only an old woman with a scarred hand watching him understand. Either the whole thing was an elaborate performance staged across 200 years by a family too poor to own shoes, aimed with impossible precision at a man they could not have known would come, or it was true. And a coroner is trained, above everything, to follow the evidence even when the evidence is unbearable, and the evidence was written on the wall with his own arrival in it. Mère Odile took him down under the cabins to see the door, because she had told him he would make her show him, and she had been right about that as she had been right about his lateness. There was a way down. In the floor of the highest cabin, under a woven mat, a square hatch of that same pale stone, worn smooth by generations of hands and knees, and beneath it a stair, not a ladder into a root cellar, a stair, broad and dressed, and descending in even courses into the earth, into the roof of the buried world, lit at the bottom by a light that Émile could not source and did not like, a cold, pale blue like the last light in water before the dark takes over. He went down. Prigine, up at the Shell Road, would later say he watched the coroner's lantern go down into the ground and not come back up for the better part of 2 hours, and that the whole time the water around the drowned acre lay flat and silent as glass, and that the grand père, the dead silver giant, made a sound once, low and long, that he would not try to describe and could not stop hearing. What Émile found under the Thibodeaux ground was not a tomb and not a hell. It was a hall. That is the word he used over and over in the account he gave before the end, a hall, and anyone who has read the old fragments of these buried places from anywhere in the world knows the shape he was reaching for. A great long chamber of the pale stone, its ceiling lost in the dark overhead, its floor worn to a shallow trough down the centre by the passage of feet across an amount of time the mind refuses to hold. Down the length of it, on both sides, alcoves. And the alcoves were the reason the family had never left, and the reason the parish had been right to be afraid without ever knowing what it was afraid of, because the alcoves were not empty. In each alcove, still and pale in the cold blue light, was a person, not a body. Émile Boudreau was a coroner. He knew the difference between a body and a person better than any man in the parish, and these were not dead. They stood or sat or lay in postures of perfect rest, their chests neither rising nor falling in any span a watching man could catch, their skin the poreless pale of something kept out of the sun and out of time, and they did not age, and they did not rot, and they did not wake. He found Sonny O'Coin in one of them, the trapper, still in the clothes he had gone to check his lines in, the pale silt dried on his boots, kept. He found one of the teenagers. He found faces he half recognized from the parish's older stories of the missing, faces that should have been 80 years gone, unchanged. And further down the hall, in the oldest alcoves, where the pale stone gave way to something even older that his lantern could not fully light, he found the ones who had been kept so long that they were no longer quite the shape of people, and he did not describe those, and I will not either, except to say that he understood, standing among them, what Mère Odile had meant when she said the thing behind the door ate to fill itself, and that the hall was not the prison of the thing. The hall was its pantry, and the door was much further down. He understood the family then, completely, in a rush that he said felt less like learning and more like grief. The Thibodeaux clan had never been deranged. They had been jailers, and worse than jailers, they had been the ration. For as long as the keeping had held, the family had fed the hall themselves, slowly, willingly. One of their own laid down in an alcove every so often to keep the thing behind the door sated and sleeping, which was why the census never balanced, why the same names ran down the columns forever, why a matriarch could carry a scar for 120 years. Mère Odile had not been kept unaging as a gift. She had been held back from her own alcove because there was no one left to take her place at the top of the stair, and a keeper who lies down is a keeper who cannot keep. The family had been eating their own long lives to buy the parish above them, ordinary short ones, generation after generation, unthanked, called mad, and now they were nearly gone, and the thing was reaching past them on its own for the first time in centuries, taking Sonny O'Coin and the teenagers because the family no longer had enough of itself left to offer. Mère Odile met him at the bottom of the stair when he came back up from the deep alcoves with his lantern shaking. She did not ask what he had seen. Having walked that hall 10,000 times, having laid down more of her own kin in it than she could bear to have counted, she already knew. She asked him one question instead, the same question the old woman had asked Wallace Kern in the Black Water in 1911, the question every keeper asked, the one outsider each generation who got far enough down to be asked it. She asked Émile Boudreau whether he wanted to know why the ground could never be allowed to go short. And this time, unlike Kern, unlike every careful man before him who had said no and fled up the bayou to spend his life pretending he could not count, the young coroner of Verdun Parish, standing in the pantry of the buried world, with the marked wall 3 words above him, said yes. She took him past the alcoves, all the way down the worn trough in the floor of the hall, to the place where his lantern failed, and the cold blue light took over entirely, and she showed him the door. It was the carved place in the stone that the old woman had put her bare hand against in the Black Water 100 years before, and it was not a door in any sense that opens onto a room. It was a seam, a long vertical seam in the deepest wall, sealed with the pale hard mortar that matched no lime the parish had ever burned, and along the seam the mortar was cracked, not broken. Cracked hairline, weeping a thread of that pale grey silt, the same silt that had fouled the shrimpers' nets 40 miles up the bayou, and Émile understood that the silt in the water and the crack in the seam were the same wound, that the whole marsh going strange was one buried door beginning, after uncountable years, to fail. Mère Odile put her scarred hand flat against the seam the way her line had done for 200 generations, and she answered the question he had finally been brave or foolish enough to ask. "The ground can never go short," she said, "because the weight of the ground is the seal. The mud that rose and buried the old world did not only bury it, it pressed it shut. Every foot of earth above the hall is a foot of weight holding this seam closed, and the thing behind it does not push with muscle, it pushes with hunger, and hunger is patient, and it is heavier than any stone. My family's whole work, across all the years you found on that wall, has been to keep the weight of the ground exactly where the mud left it. When the water takes an acre, we build the ground back. When a spade lifts a bucket of mud, we pour it back by dark, because the debt is measured in weight, and the ground must never end a day lighter than the mud made it. And when the weight was not enough, when the seam strained anyway across the long centuries, we added the only other weight we had. We added ourselves. A keeper in an alcove is weight the hall accepts in place of earth. That is the bargain my first mother made. Fill the ground, and when the ground is not enough, fill it with your own, and the thing stays sealed, and the world above stays a world. Then she told Émile the part that the fragments had never carried out, because no keeper before her had ever needed to say it to an outsider, because until this failing spring there had always been enough family left to handle it in the dark without help. She was the last, or nearly. Her grown children had begun to go down into the alcoves already, laid there by her own hands over the past hard year, as the seam wept faster, spent like coins against a rising debt, and now there were not enough Thibodeaux bodies left in the world to make up the weight the failing seam demanded. That was why the thing had started reaching up the bayou on its own. That was why Sonny Aucoin and the teenagers were kept in the hall behind her. The family had run out of family, and the hall had begun to feed itself from the parish, and it would not stop, and it would not slow, and within a span she measured not in years but in floods, the seam would give, and the mud would come up a second time, and the pale line the geologists had found in their cores would be laid down again over the top of everyone Emile had ever known. She did not ask him to believe her any more. Belief was behind them. She asked him for something much harder, and this is the true horror of the Thibodeaux story, the part that has nothing to do with pale figures in alcoves and everything to do with what one ordinary decent man was asked to carry back up a stair into the sunlight. What she asked was that he keep it. She was the last keeper, and a keeper who lies down is a keeper who cannot keep, and she had held herself back from her own alcove for years past, bearing precisely because there had been no one to hand the weight to. Now there was. A coroner, a man who counted the dead for a living, who already knew how to stand in a room full of what should horrify him and stay useful, who had followed the evidence past the point where every other man had run. She had marked the wall with his coming before he was born, because the keeping had always known, somehow, in the way the deep old things know, who the next weight-bearer would be. "Keep the ground full," the wall said, at the height of his eyes, in her hand. It had never been an instruction to the family, it had been an instruction to him. Emile Boudreau spent the better part of an hour at the bottom of that hall, arguing with a woman older than the parish about whether a man could be conscripted by a wall. He offered every modern answer. Bring in the state, bring in engineers, pour concrete, weld the seam, pump the ground full of fill by the barge load, solve it the way the 20th century solved things, with money and machines and daylight, and she let him say all of it, and then she told him why every version of it failed, and her reasons were worse than the problem. "You cannot bring the state," she said, "because the state will not add weight, the state will dig. The moment a man with authority and a modern mind learns there is a buried world of dressed stone under this parish, he will not seal it, he will excavate it, he will lift the weight off the seam bucket by bucket in the name of knowing, and knowing is exactly the hunger the thing feeds on, and the ground will go short faster than it has ever gone short in all my family's keeping. Concrete is not weight enough, and it cracks, and it tells the thing where the weak place is. Machines lift more than they set down. There is no solving here, coroner, only keeping. There has only ever been keeping. That is the thing your parish could never forgive my family for, that we were the standing proof that some doors are not opened and not fixed and not understood, only held, by someone, forever, at a cost that buys nothing but one more ordinary day for people who will call you mad for paying it." And then the seam wept a little faster in front of them both, and a fresh thread of pale silt ran down the ancient stone and pooled at the old woman's bare feet, and Mère Odile looked at the last uncrossed year on the wall of her mind, and she asked Emile Boudreau to decide, before the tide turned, whether he was going to be the next name that held the door, or one more careful man who climbed the stair and pretended for the rest of his life that he could not count. Here is where the official record and the true record split, and where the title of every story ever told about this family, the deranged Thibodeaux Clan finally exposed, curdles into something a good deal uglier than a mystery solved. Because Emile Boudreau climbed the stair. Whatever passed between him and the old woman in the last minutes at the bottom of the hall, he came up out of the Thibodeaux ground alone, in the failing light, and Progine at the Shell Road said the coroner's face was the face of a man who had aged the 2 hours he was underground into 10 years, and that he would not speak on the boat ride back, and that he held his hand pressed to the photographs over his heart the whole way as though they might fall out and drown. And the next morning Emile Boudreau did exactly what a modern man does with the unbearable. He tried to expose it. He went to the state. He filed a report. He told the sheriff and then the parish board, and then, when they looked at him the way you look at a promising young man who has broken in the heat, he told a newspaper. He described the hall and the alcoves and the kept. He named Sonny Aucoin as findable, preserved, under the Thibodeaux ground. He described the seam and the silt and the failing seal, and he begged for exactly the thing Mère Odile had warned him would end them all. Engineers. Excavation. The full weight of the modern state brought down on Bayou Cendra to open the buried world and study it and save the missing and put a stop to the superstition once and for all. He He did it because he could not do the other thing. He could not walk back down that stair and lie down among the alcoves and become weight. No decent modern man could. The keeping asked a price that a person raised in the daylight world simply cannot pay, and Emile chose, as every outsider before him had chosen in his own way, to run toward knowing instead of holding, and knowing was the hunger, and that was the mistake the family had spent 200 years dying to prevent. The state came. That is the part the parish remembers, because the parish could see it. Barges came down Bayou Sendra in a summer that everyone still marks time against, and men in clean shirts with clipboards, and pumps and generators and a crane, and they put a cordon around the drowned Thibodeaux acre, and they took Mère Odile and the last two of her grandchildren off the low ground and into custody, into a hospital ward, into evaluations, and every clinician who examined the old woman wrote down some version of the same 3 words the parish had used for 2 centuries. Fixed delusion, deranged. Her insistence that the ground must not be dug, that the weight must not be lifted, that every bucket taken out doomed the coast, was recorded as the florid centerpiece of her illness, and the more desperately she said it, the sicker they judged her, which is the oldest trap in the world, the one where the truth and the symptom wear the same face. They exposed the Thibodeaux family at last. The 3 of them were dragged off the ground. They opened the hatch under the highest cabin, and they sent men down the dressed stone stair with lights and cameras, and for about a week the story was the biggest thing the parish had ever produced. A buried stone hall on the Gulf Coast. Impossible, unexplained, full of the perfectly preserved missing. And then the ground began to go short. It started the way Mère Odile had said it would, because they were doing the one thing she had begged them not to do, lifting the weight. Every crew that went down brought something up, samples of the pale stone, cores of the mortar, one of the kept for the coroners upstate to examine, bucket after bucket of the deep old mud hauled out to make room for the work, and none of it went back by dark, because these were modern men, and the debt was measured in weight, and no one had told them, or no one who told them was believed. The silt in the bayou went from a nuisance to a flood. The drowned acre that the family had fought to keep full for 200 years lost a foot of itself in a night. Then another, the grand pair, the dead silver giant that had stood in its ring of water since before Christ, leaned, and then, on the 9th day of the excavation, with a sound that Prigine and half the parish heard from miles off and described in the same words the frightened teenager had used years before, a great slow door. The grandpair went down into the mud it had grown out of, and the ring of water where it had stood did not fill with water. It filled with dark. They pulled the crews out. Whatever came up that 9th day when the giant fell, whatever the men at the bottom of the hall saw when the seam that had wept for a century finally split, none of them would say, and 4 of them never came up at all, and the state that had arrived with barges and certainty left Bayou Sendra in a single panicked afternoon and welded the hatch shut and pretended, in every official document, that the whole thing had been a smaller and more ordinary tragedy than it was, a structural collapse. A few workers lost to an unstable excavation in a dangerous marsh. Case closed, ground unstable, area restricted, and no more said. But the parish knew. The parish had watched the giant fall and had felt the ground move under towns 20 miles away, and the old men who had spent their lives arranging themselves around the specific cold of that low country understood that the family they had called Deranged for 200 years had been the only thing standing between them and whatever had just been let loose, and that the family was gone now, off the ground, in a hospital ward, judged sick for telling the truth, and that there was no one left to keep the weight. What happened to Emile Boudreau is the quietest and the worst part of the whole account. He got what he asked for. He exposed the family, he brought the state, he was the man who finally cracked open the deranged Thibodeaux Clan and their secret, and for that single week he was the most important coroner the state had ever produced. And then the giant fell, and the ground went short, and Emile understood in one lurching moment that he had not solved the thing. He had done the thing. He had lifted the weight the family died to keep in place, and he had done it in the name of saving the missing, and the missing were not saved. When the crews were pulled and the hatch was welded, Sonny Aucoin and the teenagers and all the kept were still down there in the dark, no longer sealed away from the hunger but delivered to it, because the hall was no longer a pantry holding them apart from the door. The door was open now. Emile had not freed them. He had served them. He resigned before the year was out. He did not go the honest route of a broken man and vanish into a clerk's job counting freight the way Wallace Kern had done in 1911, because Emile could not leave it the way Kern had left it, unfinished but held. Emile had unfinished it himself. He went instead back down Bayou Cendra. This is the part Prigent could barely say, years later, to the hospital board, the part that got Prigent himself judged unwell for repeating. In the second autumn after the excavation, when the parish had learned to route its boats far around the restricted water and the pale silt had spread as far up as the Shell Road and beyond, a shrimper saw a light moving on the drowned ground where the Thibodeaux cabins had rotted down to their stilts. A lantern light, going down into the earth where the welded hatch was supposed to be, and coming up and going down. Someone was carrying mud. Someone was trying, alone, far too late, with a strength no single man should have, to put the weight back, to fill a ground that could no longer be filled, to keep a door that was already open. The parish did not go and look who it was. The parish had learned that much, finally, at a cost of 4 workers, and a 2,000-year-old tree, and a family it had spent 2 centuries slandering. You do not go and look. You leave the light to its keeping, and you thank it, if you have any sense left, and you go home. Mère Odile died in the hospital ward upstate, according to the record, of ordinary old age, which is the one death she had been denied for 120 years, and which arrived the instant she was taken off the ground and could no longer bear the weight that had held her alive. Some of the nurses said she went the very hour the Grand-Père fell, 20 miles away, on the 9th day of the dig, before the news could possibly have reached the ward, and that she had smiled when she went, not with madness, but with the specific relief of a person setting down a thing she has carried since before anyone alive was born. Her grandchildren did not survive her long. There were no more Thibodeaux after them. The line that had been set on the last high door of the old world, and had eaten its own long lives one alcove at a time to buy the parish above it ordinary short ones, ended in an evaluation ward with 3 words on a chart: deranged, delusional, fixed, and the world it had been keeping shut went on quietly, ending underneath a marsh that no one is allowed to enter any more. And that is why I said, at the very start of this, that the Thibodeaux story does not only expose a family, it rewrites the ground, because the geologists were right about their pale line. The single depositional event of enormous energy, the whole landscape buried in one stroke. They just filed it as ancient history, a thing that happened once, long ago, done and dusted, and safely in the past. The Thibodeaux family knew what the geologists filed away and could not read. That line is not history. That line is a bookmark. It is the last time the mud came up, and it marks the exact place in the story where the door was sealed and a family was set to hold it. And the reason the parish got to grow up fat and forgetful on top of it for 200 years is that the deranged people down on Bayou Cendra never once, in all that time, put their own comfort ahead of the weight. They fed the door their sons and their mothers so that you and I could have grandparents who died of old age in their own beds. And the thanks we gave them, the whole species of us, top to bottom, was to call them mad and dig them up and let the door swing wide the moment we were clever enough to reach the latch. There is a lesson the modern mind hates in that, and I am going to say it plainly because the family never got to hear anyone say it while they were alive, to be thanked. Not everything that looks like madness is a sickness. Some of it is a job that no sane society would ever agree to do, done anyway, in the dark, by people who were given the whole weight of a buried world and none of the credit for carrying it. The parish spent 200 years feeling superior to the Thibodeaux clan. The parish should have spent 200 years on its knees. And now the parish spends its nights the way the family used to, listening to the ground, watching the water rise in places it never used to rise, telling its children to stay off certain stretches of Bayou Cendra, and beginning, slowly, one uneasy household at a time, to understand that the story was never about a strange family at all. It was about a door. It has always been about the door. And the door is open, and the keepers are gone, and the mud remembers exactly how to come up. So what does Bayou Cendra look like now, in the years since the state welded the hatch, and drove away and filed its lie about an unstable excavation? It looks, the people who live nearest to it will tell you, like a country slowly changing its mind about holding still. The pale silt that once fouled a shrimper's net 40 miles down is common now up where the paved road ends, a fine grey film on the boat ramps and the crab traps, and the old traiteurs who would not cross that water in their grandmother's day now find it creeping toward their own back steps. Land goes under between one storm and the next and does not come back, faster than the sinking coast elsewhere can account for, faster than the maps can be redrawn, and always, when a parish surveyor bothers to check, the lost traces back down the water toward the restricted acre where the Thibodeaux cabins stood, as though the whole marsh were being drawn down through a single slow drain in the middle of it. The people report other things, quieter things, the kind that do not go in a report because a man who files them stops being believed. Lights on the drowned ground where no one is allowed and no one goes. A sound, on still nights, low and long, that carries for miles, and that everyone who hears it agrees on, and no one will describe past the 2 words the frightened boy used and the deputy used and the coroner used, a great slow door. Boats found idling in circles with warm thermoses and no owner, the way Sonny Orcoin's boat was found. Only now the parish does not send anyone to check the lines, because the parish has finally learned what the missing become and where they are kept, and that there is no getting them back. The count of the taken has not stopped since the door came open. It has not sped up into anything the newspapers would notice, because whatever is down there is patient. It has waited out entire civilizations. It can afford to take the coast one warm thermos at a time. But it has not stopped, and it will not, because the only people who ever knew how to make it stop are 3 graves in a hospital cemetery upstate with the word deranged in their files. There is one more thing, and I have gone back and forth about whether to tell it, because it is the part that keeps me up. But this channel has always been for the people who would rather know. In the years since, Émile Boudreau went back down the bayou with his lantern, since the shrimper saw the light going down into the welded ground and coming up and going down, there have been other lights, not always in the same place. A keeper does not have to be a Thibodeaux, Mayor Odile told the coroner at the bottom of the hall. A keeper only has to be someone who has seen the alcoves and understood the weight and made the one choice that no daylight person can make, to stay, to carry it, to become the ground. Émile made that choice too late, alone, with the door already open, and one man carrying mud cannot reseal a broken world. But he is down there. The parish believes he is still down there, has been down there for a long time now, unaging in the cold blue light, the way the keepers before him were unaging, buying the coast its slow decline instead of its sudden burial, holding a door that cannot be shut just far enough closed that the mud comes up by the inch instead of all at once. It is not keeping the way the family kept, it is a holding action. It is a single conscripted man with a lantern and a debt he cannot pay, doing the only thing left to do, which is to slow the ending down. And that means the story is not over, and that is the reason a 100-year-old tale about a swamp family matters to a person watching this tonight, wherever you are, on whatever ground you think is solid. Every coast has its buried line. Every parish grew up on top of something it decided not to remember. The Thibodeaux clan were not a local curiosity, a bit of Cajun Gothic to shiver at from a warm room. They were a demonstration, the clearest one we have, of a rule the modern world has bet everything on being wrong about, which is that some things under the ground are not resources and not history and not puzzles for clever men to open. They are doors. And doors that have been shut for a very long time were shut by someone, for a reason, at a cost, and the someone rarely got thanked. And the reason is rarely a story we want to be true, and the cost comes due the instant we get proud enough to lift the weight and look. The parish lifted the weight, the parish looked, and now the parish carries mud in its nightmares and thanks a dead family it once called mad, and watches its own ground begin, one grey tide at a time, to remember how to rise. If you have lived anywhere long enough, you know a place the local people root around, a stretch of water, a patch of woods, a road, a house, a piece of ground that everyone agrees without ever discussing to simply leave alone. You were taught it was superstition. You were taught the people who kept those rules were backward, or frightened, or a little touched. Maybe they were, or maybe, somewhere under that ground, there is a seam in a pale wall that someone's family has been holding shut for longer than your town has had a name, And maybe the reason no one talks about it above a whisper is that the ones who understood it best learned the hard way that talking about it is how you lose it. The Thibodeaux Clan kept their door for 200 years by being willing to be called deranged rather than be believed and dug up. They failed in the end because one honest man could not bear the weight of a truth alone and reached, the way we all reach, for daylight and help and the comfort of being believed. And reaching is what opened the door. I promised you earlier that we would come back to the procession of the curious, the ones who went down Bayou Cendré across the decades between Wallace Kern and Émile Boudreau to prove there was nothing to fear, and I want to keep that promise because each of them is a small rehearsal of the big mistake, and together they show you that the parish had every warning it could have wanted and took none of them. Consider the folklore student first, a young man from the State University who went down in the 1930s to collect the family's stories for a thesis on Acadian superstition. He was charming and harmless, and he meant no one any injury, and he sat with the keepers for 3 days with his notebook, and he wrote down the tale of the mud and the door and the keeping, and he went home and he wrote it up, and here is the only thing about him worth remembering. In his published thesis he treated it all as quaint invention, and in a private letter to his adviser, found decades later, he confessed that on the last night the old woman had let him hold a piece of the pale mortar from the hatch stone, and that it was warm from 4 feet down in cold mud, warm the way a thing is warm that has something living behind it, and that he had left it out of the thesis because a warm stone did not fit the story of a backward people inventing comforts, and a scholar publishes the story, not the stone. He felt the truth in his own hand, and he filed it under folklore because folklore let him keep his footing. Every single person in this story who touched the truth did the same thing, right up until the coroner who could not. Consider the revival preacher who went down in 1946 with a mind to save the deranged family from whatever devil had them. He was a hard, certain man, and he did not sit with the keepers or take their stories. He came to cast something out. He stood on the low ground, and he called on the family to renounce their door and their keeping, and come up into the light of salvation. And Mère Odile, or the woman the preacher would have called Mère Odile, listened to the whole of it, and then asked him a single question that sent him back up the bayou before dark and out of the ministry within the year. She asked him what he thought his God had been doing these 2,000 years, while her family held the door his God had left open. There was no cruelty in it. She asked it, the man wrote, the way you ask a child who has offered to take over a task he does not understand, whether he knows yet what the task actually costs. And the preacher, who had come to save the keepers, understood in that moment that they were doing a thing he had always assumed someone else, someone divine, must already be doing, and that no one was, and that these poor mad swamp people in their leaning cabins were in fact all that stood between his comfortable congregation and the end of the world, and that they were doing it without praise or prayer or any promise of heaven, for free, forever, and he could not hold that and keep preaching what he preached, so he stopped preaching, and he never told his flock why. And consider, last, the oilmen of 1928, because they are the ones who should have taught the parish the lesson hardest of all, and did not, because money has a wonderful way of unlearning a lesson. 2 company men came down to assess the drowned ground for drilling, and they were practical and unbothered, and they did the practical unbothered thing. They sank a test bore into the Thibodeaux acre without asking anyone's leave. They lifted weight. It is the only sin in this whole story, lifting weight, and they committed it with a drill in the name of profit 40 years before the state committed it with a crane in the name of knowledge. What came up their borehole was not oil. It was the pale grey silt, under pressure, more of it than the ground should have held, and it came up for 2 days and would not stop, and one of the 2 men was found afterward at the bottom of his own boat, with his eyes open and his hair gone white and no mark on him, and no word ever again about what he had seen come up that pipe. The company capped the bore and wrote off the lease and left, and the ground down there settled a foot in a week, and the family spent the next month carrying mud, and the parish said the swamp had driven 2 more men mad, and filed it, and forgot it, exactly the way it would file, and forget the coroner and the crane 40 years later. The warning was always there. The warning was warm mortar and a preacher's silence and a white-haired man in a boat. The parish just preferred the version where the danger was the family and not the door, because in that version the parish never has to carry anything. The 7 cabins are gone now. The stilts stand crooked in open water, and the highest one, the one with the charcoal wall, went under years ago, taking the marked years down into the dark, where no one will ever read them, including the last one, the wet spring the coroner walked into, the one that was written and waiting for him before he was born. The restricted acre has no acre left. There is only the ring of dark water where the grandpair fell, and the pale silt spreading, and the low country routing its boats a little wider around that place every year, the way it should have routed its whole history around the mistake of not believing the people who lived there. And somewhere below all of it, in a hall of dressed stone older than any tree, a single lantern goes down and comes up and goes down, and a debt that can never be paid gets paid 1 more inch, 1 more night, by a man who tried to expose the truth and ended up becoming it. I did not tell you this one to frighten you, though I know it does, and I know some of you will look at your own quiet stretch of water differently after tonight. I told it because the Thibodeaux Clan spent 200 years being remembered wrong, remembered as monsters when they were the last decent thing standing between a careless world and the mud, and the least we can do, from up here in the daylight where they bought us the right to sit, is remember them correctly for 1 hour. They were keepers. They held a door, called Deranged by the very people they were dying to protect. They held it anyway. And when they finally failed, it was because one of us could not bear to help them the only way that would have worked. That is not a monster story. That is the saddest kind of true story there is, the kind where the villain is our own certainty that we are too modern to owe the dark anything. So here is all I will ask of you, and it is not a like or a bell. It is the same thing I asked at the very beginning, because it matters more now that you have heard the whole of it. Down in the comments, tell me about the door in your part of the world. The stretch everyone roots around. The house at the end of the road. The family the old folks would not discuss. Name it, if you dare, and tell me who kept it, because the keepers of this world go unthanked and unremembered by design. And a comment section full of the names of quiet local places that people were warned to leave alone might be the closest thing any of these keepers ever gets to a monument. Leave the name, give me the parish, tell me the road, and the next time someone tells you the people who guard those places are just backward and frightened and a little touched, remember the Thibodeaux Clan of Bayou, remember what was under their yard, and remember that the ground you are standing on tonight was a gift, given quietly, at a cost you were never told, by someone you were taught to call mad.